Can you all hear me? Great. Well, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. I think this will be a good conversation and a very relevant conversation for this moment in American politics. Covering candidates who don't want to be covered, I think, has been kind of the theme of my career as a political reporter for the last, at least 8 years, and I think that's probably true of a lot of people here, and I think it'll be true in the year ahead. So I guess I wanted to start. We have 3 journalists here who have really kind of compelling war stories on this theme, and I think some practical advice to share. And so I'd like to dive right into that, and maybe start with Anna. So Anna, you cover politics in Florida, and you have a governor that some people here may have heard of who is nationally ambitious, it seems, and also has a very I don't know what I would say, maybe contentious relationship with the press.
Just a little bit.
Just, just slightly. Talk a little about how that's shaped the way that you cover DeSantis and how it's maybe changed the way that the kind of you've developed strategies for reporting on him.
Sure. So I've been covering DeSantis since he was running for governor in 2017, 2018. And he's always kind of been like this. Like, he's not always been one to really be accessible to the press and, going out of his way to make small talk with reporters like past governors have done. But the relationship really became contentious during the pandemic, when he was coming under a lot of pressure, I think, of what he was trying to do with those restrictions. And that's when he really started really making a brand of himself and how he was going against the press. And he brought in a team of communication staff that were almost encouraged to pick at reporters on social media. They would, for example, take screenshots of our questions and make fun of them on
the emails
Twitter.
You would send them when you
when we would send them emails for comment, or even just trying to get information about whatever the governor was doing. And so they it became almost like a strategy for them, or it is a strategy, to make headlines out of the relationship with the press. And it's been going on since, in that intense level, it's been going on for 3 years or 2.5 now. And it's not necessarily getting better. And I see other states and other Republican governors even adopting that strategy. We just have to live with it, and we can get around it in some ways, and I have some tips to share at the end. But it's just, the stories are endless, right? They either attack you personally, and then a farm of trolls on Twitter emerge, and they all attack you with the same stuff, like cry harder, and you need a Kleenex box for because they didn't let you into the event. And I don't know, it just gets predictable, so maybe you build a thick skin and you kind of get used to it. I'm almost desensitized to it at this point, but it is ongoing, and it's part of a reality that we're dealing in Republican politics.
So, I remember when I was first covering my first presidential campaign, you develop as a reporter kind of a shorthand and, maybe a little bit of camaraderie with the political professionals that you work with, or at least, traditionally that was the case. You would have the press secretary or a campaign strategist who you have a running dialogue with, and you'll ask them questions, and you can send them kind of shorthand, what do you think of this? Are you guys going to make a comment on this or whatever? It seems like when you have a candidate who is encouraging their comm staffers to tweet screenshots of your emails and weaponize them against you, that changes the dynamic, right? I mean, have you found yourself kind of self-editing or being more careful about what you put in email or messages to campaign staff?
Oh, absolutely.
Or people in
I used to be a little bit more casual, if you will, with past political staffers and comms directors, because when you humanize yourself, they're more likely to talk to you, and that would make me, they would come to me with tips and having that relationship, right, as we build sources with anyone else. But I started changing my strategy when, even a text message with a joke or just an offhand comment could be used against you without you even realizing that, oh my gosh, and the moment that I realized that it changed was when one of DeSantis's communications people started tweeting out an off-the-record conversation that she had with a reporter, and this reporter was trying to be candid and what the situation was to build trust, but we were dealing with a different, animal in terms of what the strategy was nowadays. So I've definitely started being more careful with how I communicate with them. They don't often get on the phone either because they want everything in writing just in case they can attack you for it. So it's really difficult to even have candid conversations with them and just an on background, off the record conversation.
Stacey, you have covered the Kari Lake campaign in Arizona, and she and her campaign, and I know this from my colleagues who have written about her at The Atlantic, she developed a new tactic where she made a point of recording almost every interaction she would have with reporters, seemingly so that they could use it or even weaponize it against the reporters later. Can you talk about what that was like?
Yeah, it was pretty weird as a print reporter. But you talk about preparation and you know that this is something that she does because you've seen it, and so you can somewhat prepare for it. The first time that I ever met her in person was one of these situations where her husband is actually a videographer, used to work with her at the TV station, but he is now her cameraman. So she is at a school board in Scottsdale, Arizona, really trying to lean into all the politics we've seen of school boards. And there were parents across the street who were rallying in opposition to her being there. So I went to ask her to respond to those parents who thought she was there just for political purposes, and it turned into my first debut in a Kari Lake campaign ad, it prompts, I think, interesting questions about how we do our jobs and give these candidates the chance to respond that we need to give to them, but also don't become part of these stunts that they are really using to speak to an audience. They are trying to turn distrust of the media into something that mobilizes people. And the way that I found to do that, although it evolved over the course of the campaign, was try to be, maybe this sounds bad, but as dispassionate as you can when you're asking these questions. Ask the questions you have to and push back, but do it in a almost non-confrontational way. She called us the Arizona Repugnant throughout the campaign, and
taking a cue from a former president, perhaps, in
yes.
her nicknaming game.
Yes, in that first conversation, I asked her why it was she wouldn't answer my question, and it was because of one of our columnists had written that she didn't deserve to be on Twitter because she was a liar. And I asked her if she knew the difference between news coverage and opinions coverage, which she should because she was in journalism. But that was the start of these interactions that went on for a year and changed over time. Sometimes we would be a little bit more confrontational if we needed to, if she was just lying about something that we had written, but for the most part tried to keep it very calm and very measured, because I think those interactions that she would then spread were an opportunity to show people how we do our jobs and do it in a very professional way.
So, David, this gets to kind of the big picture question that I think hangs over all of us here as we're preparing for another campaign season. We're in a moment when a seemingly growing number of candidates have figured out that drawing the press into a two-way battle and using reporters and the fake news or whatever as a foil can be very politically advantageous for them. So the question that I think that we're all wrestling with is, how do we do our jobs, provide critical coverage without kind of opting into that framing of the campaign that benefits the candidates? How do we hold these people to account and provide honest, straightforward coverage without, accidentally becoming characters in their campaign narrative?
Yeah, I mean, in so many ways, our jobs are easier to do in political coverage, technology, what have you. In this way, I believe our jobs have gotten a lot harder than they used to be. But I think we also have to think about this. I think there are two different categories, primarily, of this topic that we're talking about. There is the campaigns and candidates who strategically believe that they do not need to court, engage with most mainstream media, that they can just engage with friendly media or in their own created echo chambers and channels, and that is sufficient for their political goals. Then there's the category of, you are the enemy of the people, and I am going to make you a political actor in this equation. I think those are two different things, and we probably shouldn't conflate them. For the former, I'll just give everyone here an example. So I think we have to remain dogged in our pursuit of the assignment and covering these candidates, whether or not they are interested. We have to be dogged and respectful, which I totally think that is a critical component to how we conduct ourselves in this. But my colleague at CNN, who you probably saw a lot on the campaign trail in Arizona, Kyung La, a fantastic reporter, she was covering an event in advance of the Republican gubernatorial primary in Pennsylvania last May. She was signed up and credentialed to cover a Mastriano event that they said was going to be open press, and she signed up and she went. And then they said they closed press and you can't be here. And she, of course, she is an LA-based correspondent who had flown to Pennsylvania and was going to do the story coverage. So, and she is dogged and she is whip smart and savvy. And so what she and her producer and cameraman did, that event was taking place in the pool area, indoor pool area of a hotel, and it had rooms all around with balconies. And they rented a hotel room, and Kyung set herself up on a balcony overlooking the event because the Mastriano campaign was not in control of the hotel. They were only in control of that space down below that they were renting, so she could rent a room and cover the event from her perch on the balcony. I think, you have to always be looking for workarounds for folks that candidates that just don't make it easy for you to cover them. And I think so being dogged in that is really important. The other side, the other bucket, is just extraordinarily challenging. And I would everyone here obviously has no desire, it's not our role, we are not an actor in this political play the candidate's trying to draw us into. We are there to cover this and inform our readers, listeners, viewers of what's going on. And so I think everything you can do to take down the heat when a candidate really wants to bait you into a heated moment is an important thing to do. So just always remaining calm, professional, respectful, back to the task of what you're doing is critical. But
wait, David, can I pause you there? Because you just said something really important that I'm not sure is the consensus view in our industry anymore, or it's at risk, which is that we are not supposed to be actors in these political dramas. I guess I wonder, do you worry at all that the incentives of the last few years have started to flow the other way in our industry? Maybe this has always been the case, but I've noticed, and I'll even speak for myself, there is a tendency when you find yourself in an adversarial position with a campaign to kind of inadvertently become like a folk hero to some segment of the the voters or constituents who don't like that politician, and they end up, singing your praises on Twitter, and they read your stories, and you can become kind of like a hero for a couple days. Some people we know in this industry, and I'm not going to name any names, have turned that into their entire brand, right? They've become kind of resistance heroes in the Trump era, or in any other. I guess my question is, do you worry about how the incentives might pull us into becoming actors in those stories?
No doubt. I think that is a concern for any newsroom. My belief, call me old-fashioned, is like that is not a role, which is not to say we don't stand our ground in the moment of trying to perform our job of accountability journalism, getting our questions answered, getting the information we need. I think all of that is fair game. And if you're being like individually challenged and targeted, you can obviously defend yourself to that. But I think no reporter that I know of would want what you're saying is to become a folk hero in the political calculus of a certain segment of the voting and political population. To what end? That they're not running for office. So yes, I'm not blind to the incentives that you're talking about brand development, but I think the moment you're in like individual brand development that is separate and apart from your work product, you're in the wrong place.
Can I also just add, I would encourage you all to think about when you approach these situations, like you are an example of the media that will be extrapolated to how all of us do our jobs. So though there might be the urge to be more combative, I would just say think about how that might impact trust in our industry for much longer than the 3 days of speaking to that segment of the population.
Any kind of specific or practical tips on how to develop trust and build trust with an audience when a candidate we're covering is trying to draw us into one of these battles? I'm curious what your thoughts are.
I'll go first. So at the Republic, we basically went on offense on this point. Last year, we participated in a program called Democracy SOS, and a representative is here if anyone is interested. But it basically was helping us shape our coverage, knowing that these candidates weren't going to be accessible, helping us understand what voters cared about, how we could cover those issues, and then with a sort of side helping of how we build trust. And one of the things that we did that I thought was very valuable is my email and my cell phone number is at the bottom of every single story. And if I got a call or an email, a complaint, I would almost always respond. The meanest ones, I didn't. I don't know that you're going to reach those people. But if it was someone that just had a question about coverage or why we did something that way, I would always respond to them. And they wouldn't maybe always agree, but they appreciated the callback. So those are very specific things that I think are very valuable.
The second people start to see you as actually just a person doing your job as opposed to this caricature that's being presented, it changes the whole way that they think about you and the media and your outlet. Right?
Which is also the value, I think, of going to so many campaign events. Like, we never covered campaign rallies, and Carrie Lake had a lot of them, and she was really good at them. And I would go and be there as a source building thing. I would try to talk to people. If they had a question about, how we do our jobs, I would answer it. And I think we can be more transparent about what we cover, why we cover it, and how we cover it. And that would go a long way to building trust in the face of these attacks on our industry.
I think something that has worked for us a lot has been focusing on local issues, right? But not so much local coverage, but showing up at the local level, because a lot of the coalition that Governor Ron DeSantis has been building has been at the local level, specifically, for example, in Miami-Dade County. So the Miami Herald is based in Miami, but local school board politics have become all the rage, right? And Moms for Liberty started in Florida, and we have local school board reporters or local education reporters who have really tight sources with people who have the governor's ear on a lot of these policies. And they're not just activists or community members. And knowing where the parents are at, and just finding a workaround the candidate sometimes helps a lot in getting little scoops or little intel into how the governor is thinking, how and building trust works, that it's almost like a double whammy of a benefit, where you might get more insight into how the governor is thinking, but you're also building trust with the community, even if it's some of the most politically active ones. But that also means showing up for the other people who are not as vocal. And another thing that I've incorporated, I get a lot of emails, a lot of hate emails, and I started a little folder. And sometimes, there's certain people I don't respond to, but I do respond to some hate mail when it comes to specific criticism. And sometimes I interview those people, and sometimes their walls come down as soon as they're being listened to, and they actually want to go on the record, and they actually want to talk about the policy and why they support DeSantis, or what they would have liked to see instead. And that's a way of source building, and also gaining a little, it's not going to change how a lot of people feel about the media, but if you can make a little difference by just making a quick phone call, I think that's helpful.
I think that's great. I think both of you taking the time to respond to reader emails and complaints, especially criticisms, is really valuable. I think also we will never go wrong by underestimating how much normal people understand about how journalism works. And I think to the extent that we can explain, well, here's why I wrote this story this way. Here was the thinking in it. Here's the process that I went through. Obviously, that's a lot of time and effort, and we're all busy and we don't have time to do that all the time. But most people don't know even the basic standards of journalism. And when they're being told by candidates or politicians that they like and support that this is all corrupt and horrible and designed to destroy everything that they care about, they're going to tend to believe it. And so it does fall to us and our industry to explain, actually, these are just like the basic steps of journalism, and that's what we're trying to follow, right?
Right, and it's not just that you're spending. Yes, you're investing your time to make sure that they understand what we're actually trying to do. But then again, if they go on the record, then you are also offering some perspective from someone that they might have been difficult to find out in the community, but they're reaching out to you. So it's almost like easy that you can just do it from the comfort of your own home, and you reached out to someone who lived 5 hours away that you'd have never encountered unless you called them up.
I just want to briefly mention, we're going to start taking audience questions in a couple minutes, so start coming up with the questions you have for this group. I have a follow-up question, which is, part of the challenge of covering a campaign where the candidate is trying to turn the press into the enemy, or that just doesn't want to be covered, like you said, David, those are two different groups, but is that talking to supporters of that candidate can be challenging, right? I can't tell you, as a reporter who covered the Trump campaign, how many, unsayable from this stage words or names I was called when I tried to approach a Trump supporter for an interview. How can we go about quickly in the moment at a campaign rally or event or whatever, building trust quickly with supporters in a way that allows us to interview them, get their thoughts, understand where they're coming from? David, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think the first thing to do when, I've had the experience, as we all have, standing at a Trump rally and having the entire crowd turn around and shout that they're not pleased with my news organization,
is that what they chant? we're not pleased.
Inevitably, I want to talk to them, right? That's just the natural instinct that we all have, and I think as quickly as you can to humanize the interaction, it starts diffusing immediately. If it's literally, you're just like, hey, what's your name? What brought you here? What is it about, CNN that you instantly, people, first of all, people who are showing up at political rallies are totally of the mind that they're going to want to engage in this kind of conversation. And so again, I think if you bring the sort of professional respect to every conversation, you just find that the heat starts diminishing pretty quickly. And I think that happens in real time. I mean, that does happen in real time.
And I actually have found that once you can break through that initial barrier, most people want to talk, right? They want to be heard. They want to have their opinions valued. If you are genuinely, come to the conversation in a spirit of curiosity, not just trying to get quotes that'll make them look dumb or that serve some thesis that you have for a story you're writing, but genuinely, trying to find out where they're coming from, most people will sense that and engage. Has that been true to your experience too?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I think, an opportunity where we can tell them exactly what we are there for, and that we're just trying to understand them and put their perspective into coverage that a lot of the times they're offering a perspective that they think is lacking.
Yeah. I think we'll go to some audience questions now. Should we start over here?
Thank you all. My name is Benji Haya. I work for an international news agency called Feature Story News. So we make content for broadcasters that are not in the United States. So when you have candidates that are reluctant to engage with outlets which even their own potential constituents would, read and consume, how do you then go about approaching them with an incentive almost to speak to an international audience, someone that isn't going to be, going to vote for them anyway?
That is a hard sell in the context of people who are looking for votes or caucus goers or what have you. So I don't deny that. But I will say I'm speaking about presidential campaigns specifically, although I think this would apply to many senatorial candidates as well. But most presidential candidates do have some vision of themselves in running for this job about what they want to do on the world stage as well. And so I do think, because, part of our pitch to candidates, we have a huge international audience at CNN as well, beyond the domestic, and we incorporate that when we're trying to pitch to a candidate to come speak to us or do a town hall with us, that in addition to reaching the domestic voting audience that they would want, this is, world leaders are watching this, world players are watching this, and if you are looking to sort of put those credentials front and center for the domestic audience, it may behoove you to also be speaking to some folks who are players in the world that you want to engage with should you get to the office. All of these people seeking the presidency, you may not know this, they have a healthy sense of self, and they very much that appeals to their ego of them trying to communicate globally.
I would just add briefly, and I think this applies to actually anybody trying to get an interview with a candidate, finding out their kind of like pet issues, not just the like main things that they talk about in their stump speech, but if you can find out either from people around them, advisors, or looking at past speeches or interviews, things that they're intensely interested in, and then dropping those in the interview request, that often does help. Just saying, I want to ask about a lot of things, but specifically his view of, X super niche issue that you probably don't care about that much, but if it's kind of your gateway in, it's a good.
I'll just add real quick. So DeSantis, since he became governor, has never once granted the Miami Herald an interview, which is, in itself different from past governors, I guess. But
see that professional diplomacy that we just saw from Anna.
But right now, for example, he's in a 4-country tour. He's doing a trade mission. He's been traveling in Japan, Israel, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. He has been granting interviews to local outlets, and it's because I don't know if he thinks that he's gonna, he just wants to get his message across as to why he is particularly visiting those areas. And so I think sometimes the candidates like this, specifically around DeSantis, would be more likely to give an interview to someone like maybe perhaps their outlet than their local outlet that might have the nitty-gritty reporting on something they don't want to get more coverage on.
Over here.
Morning. My name's Tony Sandlaben. I'm a reporter and host with WBOI out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we talked a little bit about candidates having different classes of avoiding the press. Some avoid it entirely. Some only speak to friendlier ones. What would be your advice? WBOI is an NPR affiliate. And so that, like it or not, comes with the reputation of we're so liberal. And so what would be, I'm sorry, what would be your advice for getting interviews with candidates who wholeheartedly believe that and ignore us entirely?
I think they're just going to ignore you. Sorry, I don't know if that's the thing, but I mean, the workaround sometimes, you might not get the sit-down interview, but you can probably get a lot of insight into his thinking by doing the homework and listening and getting clips, perhaps like sound bites from interviews that he is granting to other more friendly media.
I just want to jump on that for 1 second, because this goes back to sort of covering events as well, not just interviews, which, there's only so much you can do if a candidate's strategy, if doing an interview with you on that station does not fit their strategy. But when we are denied access or if an organization is not giving credentials to an event, I just want especially the young first-time reporters doing this, to know there are so many other ways to continue to do your job and cover that candidacy and that campaign. You don't need. You're going to be able to see the event. You'll be able to see what the candidate actually said. And yes, there's value to being inside every room. Of course, we as reporters want all the context around and get the complete picture. But if you are denied access to a candidate, that's not the end of that. You go report around it, all the relationships the candidate has with other people. Wait outside the venue for voters to come out and talk to them about what they experienced. Engage as much as you can with their senior strategists and engage with their opponents who will be eager to talk as well. I just want to make sure, yes, we cover candidates and we cover where they are on issues and how voters are responding to them, but you always have to think in the 360-degree way about what you're covering, which if this one piece of access to an event or the candidate itself is not there, there's still so much around that you can continue to report on.
Can I just add to that really? I think that's totally right. And frankly, the best stories that we did in Arizona last year did not involve candidate participation whatsoever, because we focused on public service, we focused on accountability, and you need to give the candidate a chance to comment on that, but you don't need them to sit down and talk to you for 20 minutes for it.
Yeah, right there.
I'm Rob Cheney from the Missoulian in Montana. We added a congressional seat in the last election and wound up with two very prominent Republicans running for the now two seats, both of whom just ignored the traditional political process, wouldn't show up for debates, wouldn't show up for any event with their competitor, let alone show up for interviews with local press. And I'm wondering, at what point does that become the story? Is that an editorial or is that a news story? Because part of me wants to say the tradition of the Fourth Estate and freedom of the press as the central role of politics in America needs to be reinforced. And part of me is saying, no, that ship has sailed. Quit navel gazing and move on.
I'll take a crack. First of all, I think that's a valid story. I mean, that is a valid story to do if historically candidates in these congressional districts have always debated one another, and this is the first time they're not doing so. That seems to be a story. I mean, it was a pretty big story when Trump and Biden didn't debate in that second debate. That was a valid news story, and yes, you can report on the strategy behind it. I think it becomes navel-gazing if you're becoming, in your reporting, an advocate for they should do this. I don't think that may be an editorial, but I think reporting on their decisions and getting reporting about what was informing those decisions to break some of these norms, that seems like a valid political story to me.
There's been cases where, when covering like even legislative races, where we were trying to do the profiles, of these candidates, and they just wouldn't even cooperate. But then the other one would. And so sometimes just outlining, hey, we asked these questions, and even just doing a simple story of like, here's how this candidate will address all these policy issues, and this candidate did not respond to anything. Sometimes that can be really telling to voters. And for example, for Governor Ron DeSantis, if he decides to not sit down for an interview for, re-election, that's not news anymore. I mean, he's been doing this for years now. So it's not like necessarily new to anyone that he's like, oh, he's like he's not trying to like play ball with the press. But, it is a strategy. And so if it's a new strategy being adopted in a different state, in a different race, it was not the norm before, I think that's news, that how certain parties are adopting that as a norm.
I think we're just about out of time. I want to thank Anna, Stacy, and David for joining us, and thank all of you for joining us too. Stick around, there will be a content verification workshop coming up, and I think some of us will be hanging out in the back if we want to continue this conversation. So thank you.